There we go. We're going to get started with the hazards of temperature extremes. My name is Cole Craven. I'm the Director of Safety at TPM. And if you're on this webinar live, you're a member of the association. And so I'd be thrilled to help you out with any questions that you have. At the end of this, I'll have my contact information up for a bit. If you want to copy this presentation or if you want some further information, please feel free to reach out to me via email. But we'll touch base on that here as we go through the presentation. But let's get into some housekeeping. You should have in your upper right-hand corner a orange button. It's called the Grab tab that opens and closes your menu. Most people that are on right now muted themselves. I appreciate that because we tend to get a lot of background noise. The webcam, never fiddled with that. There is a hand raise button, but really, if you want to communicate during the presentation, the chat screen's the way to do it. You type your message, decide who you want to send it to. Could be just me, could be another student, could be everybody. And if you have any questions during the presentation, I'll try to keep an eye on those so I can answer them. But really, most everything, as with my webinars, all my other webinars, are you have questions afterwards, and there may be from this. Please feel free to reach out and contact me. As long as you're a member of the association, I have to keep saying that because we still have people watching the videos on YouTube that call and want help, and I have no idea who they are. So basically, the objectives of this is really simple. We're going to talk about why do we actually care about these extreme temperatures. More practically, though, I'm going to talk about how do we measure them. And then, out of this, there's going to be some that are, why are we even bothering talking about extreme temperatures? And this is something that you're going to see this year, and at least for the foreseeable future, this is going to be an area of focus. In an area of enhanced enforcement for OSHA for the next, few years. And this is also, this webinar is brought to you by that grant that we are working up, because I think the best way to make changes and get the word out there is by training. So as we go through this, hopefully we're going to answer all those questions for you. But I mean, really, why do we care about the heat or the cold? Quite honestly, I work with people who don't. And that is an exact quote from one of them on the hot or the cold. You just suck it up. That's just part of the job. And that's absolutely can't be the case. Any injury from heat or cold illness, whether it's hypothermia or frostbite, or it's heat stroke or heat stress, that's a workers' comp claim. We have to pay that because we control the environment that they're working in. And then also the other reason why I like to discuss this one, or why this one I think can be really important, is this is the same day in Montana. It was years back, but the temperature extremes we can have even in the same day here in the West are ridiculous. It's not uncommon at all to have a 40, 50 degree temperature swing. Be freezing at night and then be 90 degrees during the day. So there's a lot of reasons we care about it, for no other reason, for the workers' comp claim or the welfare of the worker. But we'll talk about something with the cold stress that I found very interesting in putting this presentation together. And so I know probably nobody on this call has a freezer, but I got a couple cases in here, and some where they resulted in citation. And so we got some quotes directly out of one of the citations, or a couple of them. And so we have people that even if we put them in the right gear for the environment, we've got to know that gear, that PPE or those gloves or that coat, whether or not that actually is going to address what they're dealing with. In this case, he's working in a negative 10 degree freezer, and he was wearing the gloves that were prescribed, but they weren't even close to being enough to to protect his hands, at least not for the length of time that he spent in that freezer. And he had to have a couple of fingers partially amputated due to frostbite. And that is 100% would be on us. And it would also be one where we'd have to contact OSHA, whether it's state or federal, within 24 hours, because it's a amputation as well as the hospitalization. So there's some real world costs out there with this. On the other side of the spectrum, we had a new employee at an account that was working, and he began showing signs of a seizure pretty early on. It was extremely hot weather, and he was working in a boiler room. And people saw him go into seizure, and they hospitalized him, and he stayed there for a bit before he finally died from organ failure. That his internal temperature rose so high so quickly that he died of heat stroke. And when OSHA investigated that place and took measurements just the day that they were in there doing the investigation, the boiler area where he worked was 119 degrees Fahrenheit. And so you will see far more focus from OSHA on the heat stress, the heat illness, the heat stroke side of things versus the cold stress. But I'm a big believer in, we're going to address one, let's address the other. And it's not just people who are in bad shape. It's not just people that, went drinking the night before. It's not just people who are overweight. This happens to Olympians. This happens to professional football players, professional basketball players. So there's a lot going on, and there's so many factors with heat stress that it's a really challenging one to measure and wrap our heads around. And so obviously this stuff can be very dangerous to your health. I'm very concerned about acute heat stroke. We will have, probably many through the whole association of where they had heat illness, whether it was heat cramps or heat syncope or heat, heat rash, where they're feeling sick the next day or they got a bad headache, because we used up all that water, sweat, and trying to keep us cool. But heat stroke is the one that scares me the most. And that is one that, you can bring somebody back from heat illness, from being under heat stress, right? We can move them to a cool area. We can give them, little bits to drink. We can put ice packs on them if we need to. We can do all these things to bring that person back. But with heat stroke, we can't. If somebody goes full on into heat stroke, then that's, you're working with somebody, they've been sweating all day and all of a sudden their skin turns dry and red, they're going to die unless we get them emergency medical treatment. They need to be on a bag. They need to be on IV as soon as humanly possible. That their body has just crashed to the point where it can't even afford to spend any water trying to cool it down. And their core temperature is just skyrocketing. And there have been studies that there could be links to, kidney disease, liver, heart, digestive system, all these things from repeated heat, illness, repeated heat exposure. With cold, the one that scares me the most is hypothermia, because that's where we could really have people die. I see a lot of frostbite, and some of it may be superficial frostbite. Some of it could be really severe frostbite. We get it across the range, and I do see, especially with my loggers, every single year, somebody getting trench foot. And the misconception is that it's like, really insanely cold temperatures. We've had people get trench foot and lose part of their foot going around with wet boots and socks, and it was about 50 degrees. So it's not always sub-zero stuff. It's just that hypothermia, when we start to have our core temperature drop, is absolutely fatal, and people go to sleep and die. And then there's also links to long-term, respiratory and cardiovascular effects with repeated cold stress. So it's absolutely something, that we're all going to see likely both of in one way, shape, or form. And so I'm just a massive believer in that we can plan rather than react. Here, I'm going to mute everybody. I'm getting a little bit of feedback. Sorry. All right. If we can plan rather than react, we're going to have a lot more success. So, and I know you guys already know it can be dangerous, the heat or the cold. Okay, come on now, technical issues, sorry about that. All right, so focusing on the hot conditions first. All right, and you will see some of these things come up a lot here over the next year to five. to 5 years, because this is going to be an area of enhanced enforcement. You will get emails from people saying, oh, your heat illness prevention plan isn't up to date. The people chasing that, wanting you to pay them $700 to use their service. So we do absolutely have to have a working in heat. In Oregon specifically, you're absolutely going to have one that the state has just come up with. Washington's the same thing. The problem is we've got two ways to kind of evaluate it. I mean, people just use the thermometer and they base it off of that, and that's not anywhere near enough. There's so many things in play. And so the two trains of thought are using the heat index, which is widely available. It's been in service for a long time. And we've all likely seen the charts on that. When you have this temperature and this humidity, it's in the danger zone. But the other thing you will see is the wet bulb globe temperature method. And that's what that little piece of equipment is there in the upper right-hand corner. And this, unlike the heat index, has very strict recognized work and rest cycles. So the heat index, it doesn't really tell us we have to do this or that. With the wet bulb globe temperature method, it absolutely is very clear. And this has been in effect even longer than the heat index. But you do absolutely need to know that if you go to the wet bulb globe temperature and you're collecting actual data, we have to act on that data. So it's a very, very good tool, but it is going to absolutely dictate what your work and rest cycles are. And I'll show you some breakdowns of that. So, you work 45 minutes, you rest for 15, that type of thing. If the temperatures, if the environment is high, dangerous enough with the wet bulb globe temperature method. But I'll show a slide on that here in just a bit. So why not just use the thermometer? I thought, the knowing how hot it was is enough, isn't it? And it's not, just because it's so many things. The humidity is a huge one. When I lived on the East Coast, we lived in Baltimore, and it didn't get as hot there as it does, here in the West. But the humidity was unlike something I'd ever seen. You'd go out and it could be 85 degrees out and 85% humidity, and it felt like you were breathing in, hot, like oven air. It was horrible. It was horrible. It just took it out of you. But it's also air movement. If we've got air movement, that is our friend. That is something that's really good for us, because we have to have that for our sweating to actually cool us off. You could have other heat sources. It could depend on the level of clothing and protective equipment they've got on. It can be affected by how much they're physically exerting, and it can absolutely be affected by a bunch of personal factors. Your age, your overall health, if you're on medications, if you've been drinking, if you've been eating right, if you got enough sleep. So there's a lot to this, and it's not just, oh, it's 95 degrees out. That's when we worry about the heat. So there's a lot of measurements we have to do with this, and that's why they are recommending you use either the heat index, because it takes into account some of this, or the wet bulb globe temperature method. So hold on. Okay, there we go. This is just a measurement over the course of 8-9 months. And the pink line there is just the temperature. This is what the temperature was. Well, here's how the heat index relates to that. And so it's going to fluctuate even into more extremes because of the humidity or the wind movement. Here's where we're worried, that yellow line. You go about that 90 on the heat index, not 90 degrees, but 90 on the heat index. Where we got to get nervous is 105 on the heat index. And then where we start to see people die is when it's about 130 on the heat index. And this fluctuates by month, by time of day, by cloud cover. And so it's something we do have to take, and make regular observations on if we're using the heat index. And I'll show you a couple of tools. I'm not recommending anything per se, but I'll show you a couple tools that can help you if you want to do the heat index measurement or you want to do the wet bulb globe temperature method. So here's the heat index that we've all seen. At least I imagine all of us have seen. And so you can see as it gets more humid, you see the danger increase pretty significantly. And so that humidity plays a big, role in it. You can have something where it's 83 degrees with not much humidity, and we're fine. We're not under any real stress at all. But you bump that up where we're 90% humidity, and now we're in severe stress. So this is what the heat index looks like, and this is something that you need to familiarize yourself with, or hang on the wall, or whatever, so we can start measuring this. And you can look it up what the heat index is for your individual area. That's being measured. We don't have to go and collect that data ourselves. It's being measured in our area, whether it's by the weather service or by NOAA. People are collecting this data. And the heat index is the heat and humidity, and that's easy to measure. Yeah, there's no guidelines on what we have to do at any time. There's no work rest guidelines based on the heat index. I believe you'll see much greater specifics come into play in Oregon and in Washington as this starts to develop and we start getting into that time. So this is the easiest one to measure. This is the easiest one where we get the information, but we've got to decide where we're going to change work and rest guidelines. And so this is directly from OSHA citation. And they cited the employer under the general duty clause because the employer didn't furnish conditions, of employment, place of employment free of recognized hazards. And this person, working was an area, we didn't have a heat stress program really at all. We weren't doing anything with it. And the areas they worked at were regularly at a heat index of 121. I'm going to go back a couple slides. And, that's definitely, absolutely, definitely in that fatal zone. And somebody died with this. And it was something that, we thought well, actually, the truth of it is, I'm being completely honest, they hadn't done anything. They'd have squinchers and stuff like that occasionally, but other than that, they weren't doing really a single thing. So this is you'll see a lot of these getting sold here, I would imagine. It looks like temperature to heat index, but it's not the same. It is absolutely not the same as heat index. It is absolutely not the same as just what the thermometer says. And it works. It's developed and used in the military. They've been using it for, since '56. And if you're doing true outdoor work, this is your best bet. This is going to be your most accurate bet. We'll put it that way. And this has absolute guidelines on what the work rest cycle should be. This is it right here. So depending on what their workload is, that wet bulb, that measurement, it's going to tell you how long you can work and how long you should rest. And that rest is also in an area that they get some relief, from the heat and the work and the temperature and the humidity and all that stuff. And so I don't want to get too deep into this right now, but there are recommendations on how much you can work and how much, or not recommendations, guidelines, the limit values. And so that would be the challenge with the WBGT, the wet bulb globe temperature, is that now we've got recognized guidelines and they're absolutely recognized by OSHA and MSHA and then all these other regulatory agencies. And there, that's a better picture of what that looks like. Depending on what our index is, And it is confusing because it does say degrees, but that's just the WBGT index. That's how they're measuring it. And it will very specifically tell you, okay, you can work for 50 minutes and you got to rest for 10. And it also will tell you, water intake that needs to be increased. And this is really, really important that it's not just water. There has to be you have to have a little bit of sodium in your system to process water. And I'm not saying drink salt water because that would make you sick. I'm saying that you have to have a certain amount of electrolytes in your body for your body to even process that water. So you can actually get to a point where your body's wiped out of electrolytes and you could be drinking just bunches of water and it's not going to be able to be processed in a way that's beneficial to you. And so my recommendation has always been, you do, a couple waters and then do like a Powerade or a Gatorade or a Squincher, or you do your waters and you can take those sodium tablets. But we have to have something in there to replace those electrolytes. So it's more than just water. This is honestly the approach that I see probably the most frequently. It's like, well, if it really gets bad, we'll just slow down production. That's not what's going to happen. If we're really honest, because when do we slow down production? When do we know really bad is? And if we're that busy and that fast that we're just, going at it full bore, are we really going to be able to slow down? Is that going to be an acceptable thing? So with this, it's good intentioned, but it's not realistic. It's not what ends up being ultimately applied, in the workplace. So you do have big concerns as management, managing this program. Because that's the first one. The toughest one is this just a comfort issue or a safety and health issue, right? And we tend to view it more as a comfort issue. And that's why I think going to either the heat index or the wet bulb globe temperature, we're putting kind of dots on the board that, okay, when it hits this, we've got to do this. Because it very quickly can turn from just a comfort issue to a safety and health issue real quick. And the second it does, it's entirely on us. That's a workers' comp claim that we're absolutely going to have to pay. And so with this, that'd be the other advice I'd give you, and it's not part of this presentation, but acclimation is massively important because the amount of heat that all of us can work in right now it's very little comparatively to how much heat we can work in after we've been acclimated to it and we've been working in warm temperatures for the last 40 days. So acclimation, if we can do it, is wonderful. What is that going to look like? That's a really good question. We're going to have to, be looking at that heat index or the WGBT index and saying, okay, well, looks like we're at this point. Or just be cognizant of it and those increased breaks, even if it's for 5 minutes, can help our folks acclimate so we don't go, if you go and go from 0 to 100, you're going to have people getting sick. And so the other question is, well, is it just individual complainers who just are lazy? That might be, might not be. And that's why I like just doing it. One of the indexes is, what are our facts? Okay, what do we know that's measurable? And I think we can absolutely justify the cost. Most everybody that I work with has something, whether it's, water pops and increased drink breaks or fans or heaters in the wintertime. We've got all these things we're trying to do to help the situation. So we've already committed some cost to it, but if we start measuring facts, then we can very much justify the cost, saying, okay, we're preventing this or this. And there's some interesting studies that have been done when we get into the cold stress a little bit more that, I was a little surprised to find out. So, okay, where do we start with this? Just first off, let's have a plan. Let's look at where we've had issues in the past. Let's look at where we've had employee complaints in the past. Let's look at areas that we just flat out know or we suspect are problem dangerous areas. And then we gotta gather some data, some objective data. You know, our opinions or suspicions on this need to be put aside. So we're actually collecting data, and then use the science. Use one of those indexes so we know where we're at. So at least we have a sense of a starting point. But everybody on this call, I bet, has had an employee or two that's had some sort of heat stress. I'd be shocked if you hadn't. You know, every person on this call has probably had an employee get frostbite or knows somebody who's gotten frostbite or even hypothermia. So I would look at what our history is, what the employees have told us about, take real measurements, and that's where we start. So this is what the WBGT wet bulb globe looks like. And it'll tell you right there. It'll tell you what the heat is, what the humidity is, and it'll also tell you what the index is. It's on, you know, the wet bulb globe temperature index, and it's right there. And this particular one, it doesn't have a data logging function. You can buy them that have it, and you can record time for, you know, quite a bit of time if you want to. It's just a little handheld thing. I'd recommend going out, doing it, you know, 4 or 5 times a day, just getting that measurement out there where people are working, and they're not super duper cost prohibitive. And, you know, I have to check my prices. This is a pre-COVID price, so before the supply chain crunch, but they're not terrible. But there's 100 different options out there for this. But, you know, like I said earlier, if we are getting data from this, then we need to act on that data. And we go back to those work and rest schedules that are already recognized. Here's another one that I like, just a little heat watch. It'll give you the heat temperature, the humidity, and it'll give you the heat index. And this one's a less expensive one. There's no data logging on this thing either. The readout that you get when you do it is what the conditions are at that moment. And this guy, memory serves, was about $35. If you want to just rely on your local weather service or NOAA for the heat index for your region where you're at, so be it. But with this, you're getting instant measurements, so you know what it is that you're at, that area that you're working in, and that can be a big difference. You know, what is the heat index outside your facility? What is the heat index inside where we got equipment running and we got stagnant air? And there will absolutely be a difference. So getting into cold weather work, and we've already talked about the heat stuff, and you know, with the heat illness, you know, water is our friend. You know, with the heat illness, you know, we want to, you know, if we're wet from sweating and the air movement, we're pretty happy. We're doing it. We're getting what we need, at least some of what we need. Cold weather work, it's the exact opposite. We don't like wind, and we don't like, you know, wet and water. And so this is what really surprised me. There've been multiple studies between that there's an association with you're working in the cold and cold exposure and, you know, soft tissue injuries, bad, you know, pulled back, shoulders, knees, you know, quads. That there is when you look at the data, it very much is a very strong, at least correlation between the two, if not, honestly, I think causation. And it's just 1 degree, your core temperature dropping, just a decrease of 1 degree in your core temperature. Multiple studies, it markedly impairs your performance, not just physical, but cognitive too. And so if we stop and think about that I've got people working in cold, and I already got an increased chance for musculoskeletal or soft tissue injuries, and then if they get cold enough, their mental performance is going to be impaired, and they're just flat out them walking and moving or doing their job is going to be slowed. It's not a tough employee versus a not tough employee. It's the data would absolutely suggest there's a massive relationship there. that the colder they are, the less comfortable they are, that literally the less they can move, or at least less effectively. And so I was fascinated by that, and that makes a lot of sense, because just anecdotally, working around this stuff for the last 30 years or so, the data that I've collected or the things I've recorded support both of these. And once again, as with the heat stuff, it's not just the temperature. Now we get into the wind chill, and that can make a massive difference. Now, I grew up in Wyoming, and we had a day where it was about 18 degrees below zero before the wind chill. And we had really strong winds, and it was negative 66 degrees, I think. We had like 20 kids get frostbite just walking to school that day. So it's more to it than just how cold it is, just like with the heat index or the heat stress. And so this is another table, that I'd recommend you have posted so we can gather some data and measure it and be like, okay, here's where we're at. And I have people that have asked me, and I get this question all the time, well, should we have like our own little weather station, our own little, data logging center? And that can be very useful, it can be very helpful, but that only tells you what's going on specifically at that one area. And there is going to be a difference between what's going on where people are working and what's going on basically out in the parking lot. So how do we measure these things? You can get that data logger that's a handheld one. They're a little bit more pricey. I'm a big fan of the location temp and humidity data loggers. They're a little less pricey. And you can get the little handheld units, and those are relatively cheap. And you can get those and hang them in areas that you want to measure all the time, and it's going to do its best to measure wind speed and the temperature and everything. You give you an index for the cold. And I'm sure at this point they're technologically advanced enough that you could mount them and access their information via Bluetooth. I'm sure there's wireless capabilities at this point in time with any of these. So there's multiple options out there all across the board as far as price and functions go. And with the cold conditions, just like with the hot, they're going to want to see. Well, you're gonna hear that a lot too. What are the engineering controls that we put in place? Well, we can't eliminate it. We can't eliminate the heat or the cold. That nature's going to be what nature is. So we can't do anything there, and it moves us to engineering controls. So what can we do? And specifically to the cold weather, we should have something that minimizes that air velocity, whether it's wind deflectors or barriers. We should have something that's actually blocking them from the cold air itself. And this is also where the heaters would come into play. And I see a lot of those space heaters, the 4 foot high they're like a foot wide radiant heaters, those stand ones, and those can be very effective. But I'm a big believer in measuring, and so we know exactly what we've got at that area. So we know if what we're doing it works. And then after engineering controls, we get into administrative. Well, this is the training and letting them know what's going on. And this is where the brakes would come into play. Given whatever the cold index is, do we have increased brakes where they come in? And honestly, I think the buddy system, I'm a huge fan of this with the extreme cold or hot temperatures, where we got people kind of keeping an eye on each other. Because I know from personal experience that a person in heat stroke, they don't know or care about that. You may not even know you're in heat stress or heat stroke. You may not even realize it. And you're not generally fun to work with on this. But with the buddy system, we can watch that, keep an eye on it, and we train them, of course, what to look for and what what we want them to do. And I'm a big fan of that, because you tend to see quicker reactions to that, and you tend to see less of the tough person mentality. They'll just suck it up and do it, because that's just what this, requires for this job. And then last but not least is our PPE. And this is where I would go with, honestly, with like I have people that buy those battery powered socks and gloves, and we're trying anything we can. Those were the big coats and the lined jeans and the snow boots and all would kind of fall into this area. But we have to know if we're gonna require it, we have to provide it. But we have to know whether or not what we're providing is really addressing the real measurement, the real situation out there where they're working. So that PPE is our very last option. We need to exhaust the engineering controls and then even the administrative controls before we just rely on that entirely. And so I'm a big fan of the wind deflectors and the barriers. I got more than a couple, I guess you'd call them outdoor mills, and they know where the prevailing winds come from. And so they've got things set up for that, that will block the prevailing winds in the wintertime. But they also have portable ones too that you can set up, because like with the heat, it's not just the temperature, it's also the wind speed. And so the thermometer on the wall may say it's, 36, but with the wind chill, it's negative 26. So I'm a big fan of those wind deflectors and barriers, because we want to minimize as much air movement as we can, especially if we're using heaters. Because if there's just a ton of air movement, then that heater's not really doing anything than heating the air directly in front of it. And this is where our heating systems would come in, whether it's the stuff in the building or if we're going to have those individual ones. And just on that note, on the heaters, please keep in mind that almost all of us have a real combustible dust risk. And we got to be real careful about where we put those and where we position trash cans and where we position paperwork and everything. So we do need to have some real thought going into how that's all going to be set up. So this is directly from a OSHA citation. And this was just somebody working at a grocery store freezer department. And they just filled orders. And they worked their 8-hour shift in that environment. And they were just really, we had the big jacket and the overalls and gloves, but the footwear was just regular old footwear. And he went home, and once his feet started to thaw out, he was in just unbearable pain. And you can see his toes, what's going on with those. That's frostbite. And not to minimize that, you can get way worse frostbite than that. But he ended up being hospitalized. It was absolutely a workers' comp claim, and we had thought we had everything figured out. But obviously, having somebody work 8 hours in there isn't a good idea, especially if they're just in street shoes. So there's a lot of factors, and that's the challenge with this, is there's a lot of factors that we have to figure out. But, as I said before, we just got to collect real data, and then we figure out where we're at from that data, and we act. So there all are also, we all probably have exposure to frostbite, even just from chemicals. You've got propane powered lifts, you've got a potential chemical frostbite exposure. I don't know that many people have ammonia, compressed ammonia, but I do see dry ice, and every blue moon I have somebody get frostbite from dry ice for like a company party or company function. We may need to train ourselves on recognizing the signs and symptoms of cold stress. And it's not just the mental confusion, which I believe is very real. Reaction times are delayed. Your dexterity is compromised. And so I'm definitely going to recommend we use a buddy system. And I also recommend, depending on what the real measurements are out there, we want to restrict that exposure time whenever possible. But then again, we have to know what we're dealing with rather than guessing. And so this is another one. They worked in a negative 10-degree freezer, and they're wearing gloves, didn't provide adequate protection for the hands, and they got cited. And he had the other one where he had a couple fingers partially amputated due to frostbite. So we've got to see what this stuff's actually rated for. And so, you may look at something like this, and it'll tell you exactly what kind of conditions it's approved for. And a lot of them now, they'll get you right down to a temperature. They'll tell whether it's, below freezing or even lower than that. And I'm not recommending these gloves. I'm just saying there are informational breakdowns on any of these things that are designed for cold weather work, and we need to know what they're doing, what they can handle, and if it's going to take care of what our need is. You will see enforcement to this. With heat stroke, there are standards on that now. There's no state or federal regulation on working in cold environments, but they get frostbite. Well, that's an accepted workplace injury. So I don't know that you will see that anytime soon. And right now, quite honestly, the only times I'm seeing these come up is when we've had an injury where somebody was hospitalized, and then they'll generally pull an audit from that. I've not seen this be something, feet on the ground that OSHA shows up unannounced and is auditing somebody on their heat stroke program. So it's generally the only reason we'd ever really see them, has been my experience, at least the last, this point in my career, is we only really come in response to an injury. And even then it's generally if there's been an amputation or hospitalization. So what can we do? Well, we need to start documenting what the conditions are. We need to start documenting what the employees are telling us. You can go through your company records on the safety stuff and see, we were working with our OSHA logs. We ever had frostbite before? Where did we have it? What job were they doing? And I absolutely I'd do some correlation with the complaints and the problems. And honestly, your employees right now would probably be able to tell you where it was really cold or where it was pretty miserable. So we could still get some good information, for next year's real cold stress. But right now, what I would do is I would honestly start thinking about what our heat illness response plan is going to be, so we can plan rather than just react. And just make sure the gear we've got, or the breaks that we're giving them, or the areas that they can take a break in. Do we have shaded, air conditioned places for them? Look at what the resources we have, and then let's have a plan. If you want to use the heat index, great. If you want to use the wet bulb globe temperature method, great. But it's more than just the outdoor temperature on both heat and cold stress. So it can obviously have immediate immediate health effects working in these extreme temperatures. And data has shown that it can absolutely have long-term health effects. And that air movement and the humidity greatly influences the effects of those temperatures. There's a bunch of tools. There's 128,000 different tools out there to help you work with evaluating working conditions. But we need to make sure we're getting data that's specific to us, and then go back to the hierarchy of controls and try to find solutions to whatever our temperature related problems or complaints or historical issues that have been, or where we're concerned we're going to have new ones. Once again, this is kind of a lot of information, and we're just barely getting into this. Is more of an introduction more than anything of kind of what to expect and what you're going to see, and the scuttlebutt on heat stress, I think, is going to be pretty big this year, because I know for a fact it's an area of enhanced enforcement. That's why we've got the grant that we're working on. So if you want this presentation, I'm more than happy to share it. With anybody who's a member of the association, just email me afterwards. And then, maybe even more importantly, if you got areas that you're concerned and we're struggling to get some data, or you're not sure what you should do in that specific situation, give me a call. I'm happy to come down and check it out and try to help you get some good measurements, so we know rather than just think. But I really appreciate everybody's time. I'm going to leave this up for just a little bit longer, but that is it. If you have any questions, you can either chat me right now or you can send me an email afterwards.